Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we have a special game for you in the M4A2 Sherman. In my opinion, this is one of the best Shermans in the game, and hopefully you will see that over the course of this game, and I'll try to explain to you why I like it and why I think it's such a powerful vehicle. Now, notably, I did do a video on the Sherman family in general much earlier, so if you want a general rundown on what the Shermans as a whole do, you can check that out. However, this specific tank I do feel like needs some emphasis because it does have a lot of stuff working in its favor. Now, one feature I do want to get out of the way right now is going to be the general mobility of the vehicle. The top speed of the vehicle isn't the best, but it's not awful, and the acceleration isn't awful, but it's really not its selling point. Its reverse gear is also pretty weak. It does kind of turn and maneuver pretty quickly in tight spaces, so it does make it a reasonably good vehicle in terms of its responsiveness. It's just not going to be getting you anywhere fast, especially in reverse, and that's kind of important to keep in mind when you're getting yourself into positions. Now, going straight from that, we're going to go into one of the stronger attributes of this vehicle, and that is the armor. It feels kind of weird to say that a regular Sherman's attribute is its armor, but at 4.0, this armor is quite effective. It uses the late war frontal armor of the Sherman, it has a reduced angle but increased thickness, which makes it generally more effective, especially because this also serves to eliminate weak points around the driver and the machine gunner patches, so you don't have those little bulges that enemies can shoot at. Now, you do technically still have the machine gun port, and there are parts of the turret that people can shoot at, but these aren't huge weak points, so if you can keep the vehicle moving, you can throw opponents off. Additionally, the German 7.5cm on the Panzer IV can actually struggle with this particular Sherman because it has one of the better track armor upgrades in the game. It actually covers a pretty considerable part of the frontal slope, it covers the sides of the turret, also covers the sides of the hull, or at least the upper sides. And this means that you can angle the vehicle reasonably effectively, and even the German 75 isn't exactly a guaranteed pin, which is pretty powerful because that's one of the more common guns that legitimately threaten you at this battle rating. Now, this armor isn't completely idiot-proof. It's not something like a KV-1E. If you just show somebody really good side shots, they're going to take you out. If you angle a little bit too much, your lower side behind the tracks is reasonably weak, so they might just shoot for that. Although, it's kind of dodgy at this BR how many people actually know to shoot for that. But it is important to note that the armor, while effective, isn't idiot-proof. You really have to use it in conjunction with the fact that you can keep moving because you have a stabilizer. So if you keep moving and keep slightly angled, it's going to be very difficult for the enemy to hit the smaller number of weak points, and increases the likelihood that they're going to hit something like a track armor where they'll just completely bounce. And that really is what makes the armor effective, is not that it always works 100% of the time against every opponent, but rather that the tank is very well suited to applying pressure to enemies who may have to aim for relatively small weak points, and it punishes people who try to rush shots quickly because they maybe look at you and think, it's a Sherman, it's going to be an easy pen. So overall, I do really like the armor on this vehicle, and I think it's very usable, even if it's not necessarily idiot-proof. And jumping straight from one of the strengths to the other big strength, and that is the gun. The American 75mm is a pretty good gun, especially at these battle ratings where you can generally take on most opponents with its standard M61 APHE shell. The M61 shell is an armor-piercing high-explosive shell that also has a ballistic cap, so it has really good angled performance, and its internal damage isn't anything mind-blowing, but it's usually enough to knock out an opponent if you can get the round into the right part of their crew compartment, and the penetration is more than enough to do it in most cases. It's also important to note that this particular model of the Sherman does have access to an APCR shell with better penetration if you do run into an enemy that's particularly tough, although I don't find I usually need to use it all that often. It's really just for things like the KV-1E if you should run into it, and you should probably avoid the APCR if you have the opportunity to do so, but it's not a bad idea to take a few out just in case you run into something that you can't reliably punch through with M61. Now, it's important to realize that as this is an American tank, they usually have very good gun dynamics, so your turret rotation speed is quite good, your elevation and depression speed is quite good, you also have good elevation and depression angle. I believe it's around like -10, -12 degrees, somewhere around there, so you can use ridge lines very effectively. On top of that, you have a stabilizer as well, so if you are in a position where you have a nice piece of like horizontal cover like a hill, you can pop up over the hill, fire a shot quickly, and then pop back down, and a lot of opponents in that window simply won't have a good opportunity to react to you. And this means the tank is just in general very versatile. The Sherman is capable of brawling at close range because it has the armor to try to bait out shots, but it's also capable of firing at long range very effectively as well because it can fire accurately while moving, and most opponents are now trying to shoot a moving target at a distance, which is quite difficult given the muzzle velocity of a lot of the cannons at this battle rating. And this really is one of the major strong suits of the M4A2 versus some of its contemporary Shermans. Even though they have the gun, they don't necessarily have the armor to back it up. Now, if you compare the A2 to something like, say, the Sherman Jumbo, you might think, well, the Jumbo has better armor, and while it does, it's also all the way up at 5.3. It regularly fights things like Tigers and Panthers, where its armor isn't necessarily as effective, and it also still has the 75, which is really not that great of a cannon against those particular opponents, although it can definitely work. So in that regard, I feel the Sherman Jumbo, even though it is good, it can struggle at its current battle rating, and the 76 Jumbo is at a battle rating where it can regularly meet opponents that just completely negate its armor, even though it does have the improved 76mm gun to help deal with its opponents. And if you look at some of this lower BR Shermans, the M4A1 and the M4, they both very much work, but their armor just isn't as consistently robust as the M4A2. And the 76mm Shermans, even though they have good gun dynamics, they have basically the same characteristics as the 75, more or less. The problem is they don't really have armor. The M4A2 and the M4A3 with 76 just really can't take hits, and the M4A1 either. So that's why this tank, for me, ends up being one of the stronger Shermans, because it has that combination of the good gun and the good armor. And this allows you to be as aggressive as you want to be. You can kind of push in the middle of the map. You can try to bait shots with your armor. If you see somebody that has a gun that you know is on the weaker side, you can push them very aggressively. Or if you want to just play passively and sit at long range, you can make yourself a very difficult target with the combination of the stabilizer and your reasonably effective armor. So there's a lot of versatility to this vehicle, but it is generally the best at close range, because there are some opponents that you're really going to struggle with at long range, especially if you get a bit of an up tier going. Now, in the basic video on the Sherman, I went over vertical cover and horizontal cover. A vertical cover is something like the edge of a building or a rock or some kind of corner that you can use. The horizontal cover is something like a hill, where you can come over, you drive over it and look down on targets. Now, the A2 in particular, you have the gun depression to use hills really effectively. Your turret armor isn't the best, but it's often good enough, or as good as it needs to be, given that you can poke over the hill and fire your shots off relatively quickly. And if you see a situation where you can use horizontal cover, the tank has enough armor to try and bait shots, especially if you run into somebody that you suspect is not the most experienced of players. So because the tank is good at using both vertical and horizontal cover, there really isn't going to be a position on any map that you can't use. And you kind of see this throughout this game, where I'm using both positions where I'm shooting over targets and positions where I'm shooting around things. And in general, I think the Sherman, on the whole, is always at its best when it can do basically a little bit of everything pretty well. The Shermans that tend to heavily specialize, like the M4T26 or the Jumbos, can kind of lose this a little bit, just because the guns are less effective or the armor is less effective. So overall, this is where I think the M4A2 really shines, because while the mobility isn't great, the gun and armor are fantastic, and the mobility isn't bad enough to ever hold you back. And so yeah, that's my thoughts on the M4A2 75mm. You probably noticed in the background, this is a 12 kill, 1 zone cap game, and that is enough for a nuke. So if we were at a higher BR, we would have definitely been dropping a nuke in the Sherman, but turns out we're not. I'll just settle for a 12 kill game and call it a day. We did ultimately end up dying, but it was at the very end before the buzzer hit, but whatever. It is what it is, I don't really care. It was a great game, and it showed off a great tank, and I really hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. That really helps out the channel. Have a nice day, everybody.